I agree that governance is important. It's like, okay, well, if you're the owner, now you're accountable and responsible for that.
How to pull these things together requires some knowledge and experience, I think.
It's very easy for any GenAI to start hallucinating and give you the wrong answer.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Reporting Norms. Today, I have a very special guest, an expert on data. He is the head of data and analytics at Elastic. I'd like to introduce to you my guest today, who is Takashi Ueki. Hi, Takashi. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Norm.
You're a data democratizer who can translate terabytes into board-level decisions. In addition to that, as I mentioned, Takashi is the head of enterprise data and analytics at Elastic, where he is tasked with defining, establishing, and scaling the functions of enterprise reporting, analytics, data governance, and data strategy, building these functions from the ground up since joining the company 4 years ago. Today, Takashi at Elastic operates with a unified and governed data foundation that drives trust and insight across the organization. Since you stepped into this role, you have been focused on one guiding principle: democratizing trusted data across Elastic. Under your leadership, Elastic has established its first enterprise-wide data governance program, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and consistency across a globally distributed business. You led the rollout of a modern data catalog to operationalize active metadata management and established governing bodies to bring alignment across embedded analytics teams. These structures have been critical in harmonizing metrics, defining enterprise KPIs, and promoting a single source of truth, or SSOT, allowing Elastic to scale self-service analytics across functions. And as part of this focus on consistency, transparency, and governance, Elastic, through your help, Takashi, implemented a DBT-driven data architecture with clear model layers, raw, staging, intermediate, marts, and reporting, supported by CI/CD pipelines, environment-aware access, peer-reviewed, and version-controlled transformation. With a strong emphasis on active metadata, his team has embedded governance, lineage, and data context directly into user workflows, ensuring analysts and business users alike can access and interpret data with confidence. His strategic direction has helped Elastic evolve from traditional business intelligence to a platform positioned to take advantage of next-generation use cases such as natural language querying and, of course, agentic AI. By building a resilient and scalable analytics foundation in close partnership with cross-functional stakeholders, Takashi has enabled a future-ready data ecosystem that delivers value from the executive level to the front lines. Takashi's path to data leadership hasn't followed a conventional route. Coming from a consulting background spanning finance, sales ops, customer success, IT, and analytics, he brings a business-first perspective to every data challenge. His background gives him a unique ability to bridge the gap between technical teams and business leaders, ensuring that data strategy is always grounded in real-world impact. Takashi is passionate about aligning teams around common metrics, operationalizing governance in practical, scalable ways, and empowering organizations to turn data into action. He regularly advises on best practices for implementing metrics layers, building adoption across enterprise tools, and enabling self-service analytics in complex environments. Well, with that introduction, Takashi, welcome to the show again.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here. There's one statement in the intro that I just read that talks about where Elastic implemented a DBT-driven data architecture with clear model layers, raw, staging, intermediate, marts, and reporting supported by CI and CD pipelines. This sounds very unique to Elastic, but maybe you can expound, just comment a little bit about, what do you mean by DBT-driven data architectures?
Yeah. Well, first off, Norm, just wanted to say thank you for having me on, and it's always a good day for me when I get to have a chat with you. Although, we don't get to have lunch anymore since you moved out of California. To your question, I would say what we've implemented in terms of it centering around, from a DBT perspective, that's not uncommon. And I would say more modern, progressive data teams will be leaning in that direction. I think, you can implement DBT, but it's really more from a principles perspective of thinking about data as a product and taking a lot of the best practices and principles, how you do, software development, and taking that and treating your data and your data pipelines as a product as well. So having that mindset. And I think the biggest, advantage and driver for bringing in this way of working is really more around proper governance, around how we model our data and our data pipelines, consistency and transparency across our data lineage. So it's an enabler of getting to those first principles, but those are key in building the trust across our full data pipelines for our end users, and the consistency through which and transparency through which our data teams can also work off of. So it's been a huge benefit for us. And I would say it's going through that exercise also kind of, we had a spider web of data, everywhere. It's like, okay, well now bring in the proper structure, bring in, those first principles, and then start transforming how we operate and being more consistent and thoughtful about how we do it.
And would you agree with the statement that true sort of one SSOT, single source of truth, a pure SSOT might be somewhat aspirational and it can be very difficult to achieve, but
Yeah.
in this DBT data architecture, you can get pretty close. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And, to your point about getting like a single source of truth for a lot of our data it's always something that we aspire to, but there, when you're looking across a whole company and servicing different functions, there's always going to be different needs across the business. What is needed from a marketing perspective or a sales perspective might be different from a finance perspective. So how do you actually meet the needs of all those business stakeholders in one single source of truth? So you do, the best that you can, and always keep in mind of like, okay, that 80-20 principle of, as long as if we can get to the 80%, at least we know for the majority of what people are working off of, it's a single source of truth. Then you start to think about, okay, well, what are those variabilities that you have for different operational needs? And then how do you account? So, if you then flip it back to, okay, well, when you look at it from a DBT perspective and how we operate, one of the advantages there is being able to co-collaborate on our code across all of our analytic teams and being able to have that visibility, transparency of, hey, someone, from sales says, hey, I want to add in this additional field or tweak this logic. Here's my recommendation, and we can all review it and see it and work more real time versus having to, funnel it kind of through a bottleneck and, oh, I own this code, so I'm the only one that can make changes. So it democratizes access in that way. Obviously, it's all governed, it's all transparent, so you still have that benefit, but it makes us a lot more nimble in how we're able to react to the various needs of the business.
Yeah. You just talked about democratizing data. And so you've led large scale efforts to democratize data. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about what does that, actually look like in practice? You kind of touched upon it a little bit where, different needs within the business, you have recommendations or thoughts, and why is it, difficult to kind of get that right? So yeah, just talk a little bit about, democratization of the data.
Yeah. And, to your point, I'll start with like, what makes it so difficult? And you alluded to it before of it. There's like kind of three things of people have different definitions and expectations. And that's just natural because you're working with, folks from different pockets of the business. Making sure that you have an appreciation for where people are coming from and what's important to them is always going to be imperative. So, and I think this is where my background kind of benefits me of understanding, like when I'm working with someone from, sales ops, understanding their perspective on what they're trying to accomplish and bringing those considerations in. My background in finance, like, okay, what do finance people typically care about and want? Making sure that you understand those definitions and expectations is always going to be critical in making sure that you can be successful. The next thing is it's very easy to lose trust. And, when you're working with data and how complex and widespread it can be, if you get one thing wrong at the wrong time for the wrong person and that experience goes haywire, you immediately lose that trust. So that's where it's like, okay, how do I democratize access to data, but also ensure that the experience is in a controlled way so that they don't have a bad experience in, how they're, in what they get out of it, right? So I think those are the kind of the difficult things. So when you look at like, what are some of the things to keep in mind? I would say one, and this goes back to what I've commented on, understand expectations, have a realistic scope of what you want to democratize. Don't just throw everything out there and say everybody now has access. And then the last two things I would say is meet people where they are and be transparent. And what I mean by that is there's no one size fits all way of democratizing data. And you can't just say and prescribe, here's how we're going to make data available to you and hope and pray that everybody then, aligns to that. You're going to have different personas of people across the business that want to interact with data in different ways. So how do you meet them where they are and allow access to data from a single source of truth, obviously, but also allow it in different ways and different experiences for different personas? And then the last thing I'll comment on is just transparency. A lot of, folks kind of tend to think of, okay, well, I need to make sure that the data that I provide is always pristine and clean and always accurate. And only then will I make it available to people. In reality, what I think is more important is like be transparent about the state of your data and make that information available to people when they have access to it. Norm, for example, if I were to say, if I was working with you and I say like, hey, Norm, here's this report. There's some underlying issues that we're working through. There's probably about a 5% error rate. And if I'm transparent about that, then you as a, business stakeholder can say like, oh, okay, great. Now I know if I'm making a decision based off this, I need to factor that into any decision. I can't take it at face value, but I can know directionally this is correct. And okay, if I'm going to now add in some variability to it, what that range looks like. So you're not diminishing the trust because you didn't deliver 100% accurate data, but you're providing the context and the information so that the users can actually make the decisions to the best of their ability.
The transparency is pretty key. How do you communicate that variability though? It's saying, hey, the data set that I've been working with, I'm
Yes.
comfortable to 95% confidence level. Yeah. What's from a practical standpoint, how do you communicate that?
I would say there's two things. I mean, there's an aspirational aspect of it that we're working towards of making all of our, data quality metrics, readily available in every single report users have access to so that they can see it where they're working. In practical terms, there's this tendency that people want to kind of don't want to share the dirty laundry, right? It's like, well, no, just be transparent and communicate consistently. Here's where some of the, the problems are. Here's what we need to keep in mind. But I think you need to balance that too of like, okay, well, here's how we're planning on addressing it, right? An executive doesn't want to keep on hearing that like, oh, well, we have a problem. So you're going to have to accept that it's off by 10%. It's more of a, here's where we are. Here's the reasons why we have, some of these issues. We are actively working on addressing those. But as we're working through it, here's kind of the variance that you might see in the data. And I think the other thing to keep in mind too is understand how people are planning on using the data. So what I mean by that is, and this is obviously more from a financial perspective for this podcast of if I were to say, hey, this has to go into our financial statements or as part of our earnings release. Okay, well then I need to be way more accurate, right? We're saying like, hey, we need to make, some directional decisions about how we allocate budget. And I just need to know directionally like where we're going, with a confidence level of 10%. Okay, well then I think this is completely acceptable. So the more that you can understand how the data is going to be used, then you can start to calibrate, okay, what's the tolerance and acceptance level of some of that variance that you might have.
And so you talked a moment ago about different groups having different purposes and different objectives. So how do you get sort of business alignment around strategy when you have, different teams and different departments speaking different languages, sort of language, if you will? How do you get that alignment?
And again, as I was alluding to earlier, this is where kind of my background helps and I use this, the word empathy a lot when I talk to people. And, what I mean by that in this term is when I'm working with various teams, understand what they care about and what their motivations are, and really think about it from their perspective of like, okay, well, what are you trying to get out of it from your end? And then kind of put that hat on across all the various teams. And then, synthesize all that to say like, okay, well, what's the common ground that we have? And here's kind of the proposal that kind of meets the needs of the 80% of what people are looking for, right? And the one advantage is if you think about where a team sits, and this is getting into like organizational structures, if you have people that are trying to drive these initiatives that are purely embedded within one function, all other functions will look at it and think of it as, oh, you're always going to default to the viewpoint and the perspective of the function that you live in, right? So you want to have, you want to be a little bit more of a neutral arbiter of, no, I sit outside of all of this. I don't have a vested interest in how marketing does or sales does or finance does. I want to serve all. Right. And then by taking that more empathetic approach of like, okay, well, I understand where you're coming from. Here's what's about important to you. And here's what our proposal can be in terms of how we execute on this. I think that's how you build that alignment and that trust. You need to build that trust of like people knowing that you are hearing and listening to what's important to them. And when you do that, then they'll trust that, whatever proposal that you come up with is actually in the best interest of them as well.
It sounds like you have, because of your background, you have a pretty wide range of experiences, in finance as well as operations across the company. So as you work with different groups within the company, you have an understanding of what their kind of needs are, what their objectives are already. So you're able to balance kind of what they need with what you have available data wise.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's your sort of special sauce discernment that you bring to the table, isn't it?
I like to think so. Yeah. It's my one.
It's a very valuable skill and knowledge base because intelligence, is on tap, right? But in terms of judgment and, how to pull these things together requires some knowledge and experience. I think you bring that to the table. So that's really a good perspective. So you've been described as someone who can translate terabytes of data into actionable insight. So what's your process for getting from raw data to strategic clarity?
Yeah, and the first thing I'll say on that one, and people may have said that about me, but I would say it's probably more on the backs and because of the teams that I've led and all the smart people that I've had around me that I've been able to do those things. Leading these types of teams, though, there's two things that I always kind of come back to and always keep in mind. One is just avoid the rabbit holes as we're going through this and focus on answering the simple question first. And there's a communication framework called the pyramid principle, and it's at the top of the pyramid, it kind of says like, okay, just answer the simple question that people care about first, right? And so when we're doing these analysis and when we're working with data, it's very easy to get lost, the weeds. And to say, you pull on a thread and you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. Now let me go dig into that. Oh, well, then now that's interesting. You go dig into that. And then you like a day later, you realize like, I am like a mile away from where I need to be. So I think it's just continuing to remind our, the teams I work with and remind myself of those are interesting paths to dig into. But let's put a pause on that and always just focus on what was the simple ask that we had. What was our executive or our business stakeholders really looking for? Let's figure out how we answer that question. We don't have to answer it in 20 different ways. We don't need to have all the analysis built out. But what's that simple ask first? Because if you can't get that part done, and you're going to lose their interest and that credibility very quickly. So you say, okay, well, what's that first? And then you can move into, okay, well, here's the analysis that supports it. And here's all the threads that we followed that kind of give you even more tidbits of information and insight that they didn't even expect that support that, that first principal answer. And the reason I say that is like, and I understand why. It's like when you put so much effort and work into data and the analysis that you're doing, you kind of want to have this idea of like, oh, well, I want to show everything, all the work that I've done because I've invested 40, 50, 100 hours into it. But in reality, it's like you're going to lose your audience very quickly if you throw too much at them because they'll get confused. So just say, what's the first answer that question we need to answer first? How do we do that very succinctly? And then start moving down into, okay, well, what supports that?
I see. Very interesting. Do you think Gen AI has facilitated the ability to go down rabbit holes, much more easily and perhaps get sidetracked a little bit, unexpectedly or, unintentionally?
I mean, just in terms of like how I use some of that, and
Yeah.
I was absolutely. It's kind of like when people say that they used to get lost in those Reddit threads and just you're 2 hours later, like what happened? But you just ask a question, you get another, you're like, oh, I have a next question. On the Gen AI topic though, what I would say that, especially when it comes to the space that I work in, more reporting and analytics and business intelligence, and there's always, there's this constant push, and I'm sure my peers across any company are feeling it from their leaders of, we need to push more AI and we embed it in everything that we do and all this kind of stuff. But with anything that kind of comes up, it's the basics that we need to get right. And for Gen AI to work effectively in this space, there's two kind of ingredients that you need is one, quality of the data that you're pushing in, and then two, making sure that we have the right context. Our governance program has always been focused on those two things because those are just like table stakes for any type of data program that you have, even before Gen AI. But with Gen AI, it's even more important. What I mean by that is like, well, we need to make sure that the data that we're pumping in is accurate, complete, and all that. And then two, that we are also incorporating the right context of that data. So what that means, and this is where our metadata layer comes into play of all of our reports, all of our metrics, all of the fields that we have that we're pumping in, that we have the right descriptions and the right context that are also, that metadata is also going into any LLM. And the reason why that's important is if you don't have that, it's very easy for any Gen AI to start hallucinating and give you the wrong answer. So though, like if I were to boil it down, like those are the two things that I continue to preach of like, okay, quality, which we've already been like, working towards, but that context, that metadata layer is absolutely critical before we can get to rolling out any type of Gen AI capabilities in this space specifically.
Yeah. So people that may listen to this podcast may be thinking, in my organization, I've got disparate data sources, and they may not all be hygienic and as clean as they could be. If you have a situation like that, what is your thought on trying to ensure reliability of that data and then the quality of that data before you start diving into some deep analysis, since not everyone can have you in their company to make sure the metadata and context is clean?
I'll say there's kind of two paths, right? There's the one of the more longer term of building out the right data quality monitoring on that data so that you can then say, okay, well, what are the actual problems? And then, going back to the root of the process, the policy, the system to fix those to improve the quality of it. But I think your question is more geared towards like, okay, well, I don't have time to wait 3-6 months or whatever it is. I need this analysis now. How do I work with it? I look at that in a couple of ways to say, One is understand, what those sources are, who owns them, and what has our experience been with it. So then you can kind of start to gauge what's that level of variance that I can potentially expect, from those data sources. What are some of the things that I need to be on the lookout for? And then the other thing too is like, okay, well, at what level can I rely on the data? Right. So there might be instances where it's like, okay, well, at the top line level, it's fine. You start drilling down one or two levels down. That's where the quality of the data starts breaking apart. So if I understand those limitations, then I can start to make sure that I'm designing any analysis and also communicating to my stakeholders of, here's what this analysis is going to look like. We can only do it to this level because of these reasons, because of these limitations. So it goes back to, what I've been kind of reiterating quite a bit is being transparent and communicating with your stakeholders of, what you can deliver and when you can't and why. And then also then layering up like, okay, well, here's how we plan on working with, the business data owners to then now go address those in the future.
You mentioned about what is our experience with that data and who owns it. Kind of to your point earlier about people who own, a particular data set will have certainly a level of ownership and pride of ownership, if you will, of that data. And so do you think that transparency in that regard can sometimes be potentially challenging because no one may want to say, well, here's my data set. It's got all sorts of problems with it, but please, use it to the extent that you can. How do you number one, how do you gauge the quality of that data? And then number two, do you make a decision around whether you go ahead and, attach some, Gen AI to it for deeper dives and analysis?
Yeah. To your point, it's like, when I say how much can you trust? And to your point, it's like, yes, people are going to have a certain level of pride. And what I mean by that is for their use cases and purposes, the data might be fine. But for how we want to analyze it, it may not, they may not have been paying attention to those aspects of it. So that's where it's like, that understanding like, oh, well, they're using this data purely for operational purposes so that they can get a directional answer to inform, how, what direction operation they're going. I need to do financial analysis on it. There's a different level of acceptable variance, because of those use cases. So I think that's really what I was meaning more so than like, okay, well, I can't trust the data at all. It's like, well, no, you can trust it for certain things and it's built for that purpose. For different purposes, it may need a little bit more attention, going forward. Your point about ownership from a data perspective, like I'll kind of make one comment that, people may not always appreciate, but people like to say they own data in their domains, but usually that's because they want to be the owner of it so that they have the ability and the authority to make any changes to it as they see fit when they want to. Then when you start talking to them about like, okay, we need to properly govern it, control it, and have the right policies and process around it, they'll usually say like, yes, I agree. Then you get to the next point of the conversation of like, well, this is what it's going to require. And that's when it's like, well, I don't know if I have the time or the budget to do that. Right. So it's kind of that sliding scale of like, yeah, I want the ability as the owner to do what I want with the data for my purposes. I agree that governance is important. It's like, okay, well, if you're the owner, now you're accountable and responsible for that. Oh, and that's where, it's kind of hard to kind of get people across of like, I get that it's more work, but how can we make it embedded and how can we help you build those governing principles and practices into your normal operations so that we can improve the quality of it without making it too disruptive to, your ongoing operations.
So the reality is that the governance and the controls around great data governance is extra work. There's really no way to get around that. I mean, I kind of analogize that. Yeah, I kind of analogize that to SOX controls, where it's extra work to document what you did, right? And if you're not used to it or if it's not a requirement, you're not going to do it. But you're saying that that's part of the communication, that's part of the education, that's part of the requirements that you instill in your stakeholders.
Right. And that's where I think, having a consistent framework and making sure that you have the right enabling, tools or processes or frameworks kind of built out so that you make it as painless as possible for them. Right.
Yeah.
So if I go in and say like, hey, you are now the owner of this data, you're responsible for this, make sure the quality is better. And they're like, I don't even know where to start. I don't even know what to do. And that sounds like a lot of work. It's a very different conversation if I say like, hey, as a business data owner, this means that you get these benefits, but it also means that you're accountable and responsible in this way too. But here's this like, full toolkit things ways that we can work with you on, implementing and to enable and get to that point. We're going to work right alongside you in doing this. You're not on your own. And we're also going to, help provide, different ways that you can kind of measure progress over time, so you can make sure that you are seeing the benefits of it as well. And then also then being conscious of, okay, well, I need to also be able to communicate this in a way that says it's important to you as a business owner for these reasons, not because I'm telling you we need a governance. I'm telling you it's because it's going to give you these benefits in your business function. So like that's where it's like making sure that you have that right level of communication is also hugely important.
Earlier, you talked about metadata, context, master data management, DMD. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the importance or relevance of metadata, context, and data management, and the importance of that, just kind of in plain layman terms.
Yeah. So, from a metadata management perspective, and all that is just like, the data about your data. What we want to do is make sure that we can propagate that across all of your data pipelines, meaning if we are creating context and metadata from our source systems, that I want all that to propagate all the way down through our data pipelines and into your end dashboards and reports, so that people, the way a lot of people do it now, or how it's occurred historically without is you in your source systems, you have a description in Salesforce or NetSuite, and okay, well, that's there. Then you go into, your data warehouse and people are writing code, and then they have descriptions embedded in their code. And then you get to a dashboard and someone has some descriptions on a cover page for that dashboard. How do I ensure that all of that is consistent and aligned? I don't. Right. So when we talk about metadata and like being able to propagate it across our full pipeline, it's to say, okay, well, from source, this is how we define it. Now that moves all the way through. And if we define something, I'm able to then now associate it to all the various supports, and I can manage it in that way so that I can propagate all of that information across all of our whole data landscape. And it's important because then you can start to then connect everything to say, okay, well, if I have this metric, here's how we define it. I can now see everything upstream from it. I can see everything downstream from it. I know, where everything is. So the more that we can get into that practice of doing that documentation, which nobody likes to do, but then doing it in a way where it's like you do it once and then it propagates everywhere so that you don't have to constantly do it, and do it systematically and leveraging, different tools to say like, okay, if I make an update here, it propagates everywhere. So I'm not constantly chasing my tail of like, oh, I now have to go update 20 different dashboards with the same information, right? Then you also mentioned, master data management. Comment on a couple things there. One is like, is it important? It's like absolutely critical if you want, that we're using consistent single sources of truth, right? And if you don't, then you just open yourself up to this deterioration of trust from your users, right? And usually it doesn't happen within a single function. It's when, different functions start interacting with each other. And what I mean by that is if I have a team that is responsible for reporting for sales, and then another team reporting for finance, and another team reporting for marketing, if they're using different sources of truth and they say, okay, here's my report to my executive, and here's mine to this one and to this one, right? It's fine. Like nobody is, wiser to what's going on, right? But then when you start to say, okay, well, now I'm comparing my numbers across these and I see a disconnect, that's where you have that problem, right? And you're always, just human nature is going to be, I'm always going to look out for myself, and I'm always going to trust and defend myself and my domain. So it's like, okay, well, my numbers are right. And then you have this kind of like this tension across, different teams. So it creates so much friction. So it's like, why even allow yourself to open up to, that friction and that disconnect, and just focus on making sure that you have those, single sources of truth and you're able to manage those effectively. But the last thing I'll mention on that is, a lot of people, when they say like, okay, well, we need proper master data management, they say, let's go buy a tool. And it's like, that's the wrong answer. Now, there's great tools in the market that help enable and accelerate better master data management. But the most critical thing is it's a discipline that requires cultural changes and implementation of proper processes, policies, and then, that we are assigning the right ownership and accountability. Those are the three key ingredients when we talk about master data management. You need to focus on those first, and then you can start thinking about, okay, well, what tool can help enable and accelerate us in this area?
So talking about, master data management, propagating, consistency across documents and reports, is that typically done by one quarterback within a company, or, or a department, or, terms of, having some master, it seems like when you have a centralized repository of a single source of truth, you're going to have a limited number of owners, or, a very defined set of owners for that particular data set. So is that what you would consider a best practice? Or typically, how would a company, have a DMD function?
Yeah, and that's where it gets tricky, right? Because like if you centralize too much of it, then you create these bottlenecks and then you move a lot slower, right? And then it's like, oh, well, for me to get to that, then I have to go through this like single channel and then it gets built and I'm waiting. And it's like, okay, by the time you actually deliver on it, the people are like, well, I created my own thing and I'm just doing I'm doing it my own way. It's like, well, that was a fail. So there's a couple things that, a couple governing bodies and ways that we operate that we implemented. One is kind of starting at the top to say, if I have representation across all of my business functions and I say, okay, well, do we agree on what we need to measure and how we measure it? So, these are obviously more like senior director or VP level folks across the different functions. And we kind of get together and say, like, what are those key metrics or definitions or hierarchy structures that we need to align on? How do we make sure that those definitions fit the needs across the whole company, leaving some room for some edge cases where we say like, okay, well, here's our standard, and then, here's our exceptions, and here's how we do it, right? So we made sure that we had that so that we can get that business level alignment. And then underneath that, we have, another central kind of governing body that is more of our analytic teams. And we say like, okay, well, based off of this definition, here's how we're going to build the data to enable that. So we agree that cross-functionally that this works. Now how do we build it so that we're all using the same single source of truth? So it goes back to my earlier comment about, when we talk about DBT, also of having that ability for people to say, okay, well, I want to make this, you recommend changes to our shared assets that we all use as our single source of truth, but the ability for different teams to say, hey, I need to add this. Here's the additional logic I'm building in. Does that align? Do we agree? Are we okay with this? But we're able to move a lot faster, even though it's a central kind of data asset. It's kind of, we have the ability for, multiple people to contribute to it.
So it's like a governance committee that department would consult with if they wanted to make a change or modify something. Like, for example, you talk about definitions, right? Data definitions got to be something that has to be agreed upon universally within the organization, right? And so that can only be achieved, I think, through sort of a meeting of the minds amongst department heads and, like you said, senior directors, VP level people that agree on a data definition. So is that like a governance committee? What have you seen in terms of what works well to facilitate the governance, but also not become a bottleneck?
Yeah, there's a couple ways you can do that. It definitely is a governing body. And to your point, it does become a bit of a potential bottleneck because just getting, those folks together on a consistent basis is always going to be tricky with, people's calendars. So it's also the way that we certify our data. So if I say like, hey, within the business, someone's proposing a new metric and they say like, I need this now, we'll do kind of a quick overview with them of like, does that logically make sense? Do I agree? Can I give you some recommendations of what data sources are you using? Do we agree with that? Does that make sense? Okay. You can go use that. It's not certified from that governing body's perspective. We'll push it through that governing body, but just keep in mind that like, as you're using it, these are the limitations and make sure that you're communicating it accordingly, right? So I never want it to be a bottleneck for people to do what they need to do. Because if you're not flexible, then they'll never come back to you the next time, right? Because if I say like, okay, well, you can't use it until I bless it, they're like, okay, well, I'm just never going to tell you in the future. So you have to have a little bit of that flexibility. And I think the biggest thing there is, are you at least using the data sources that are certified? Right. So you might have different permutations and different logic that you apply to it to get to a certain metric or analysis that we need to work through. But at least are you using the right sources? If, they come back and say like, hey, I plan on doing this. Okay, logically, that makes sense. Okay, what are your sources? And they say, well, these. And I'm like, I don't even know what these are. Like, why are you using this? Then that's a huge problem. But if they say like, hey, I'm going to be piggybacking off of our certified data for this, this, and this. I'm going to be using these attributes. Oh, okay, that makes sense. I at least know I can backtrack to how they did it and say, yes, they used the right sources. We're still working through the logic. That hasn't been blessed yet, right? So it's being a little bit flexible in that regard.
You just use the word certification. In your company, are you the sort of the leader of sort of that certification process as a governing body of looking at the data across the company?
Yes and no, in the sense of like, there are certain assets and data products that we say like, we need to be the ones that are certifying it because they are kind of enterprise-wide shared assets. So we need to make sure that we are comfortable with it. But then, what we did was we said like, okay, well, here's our framework for certification. So there are, and then you need to get to the point of like, okay, well, things can be certified if they meet this criteria, these requirements. However, depending on who, where that asset and that data product is, who owns it and where, and who the end users are, it may be that within the function, you can certify a function specific data assets are certified by, our analytic leads in those functions. So it's more of like, do we have a consistent way of how we think about certification? That's the most important thing. How we then execute on it, we can be a little bit more flexible. But if we don't have a consistent way of saying, okay, well, the certification means this, then it means absolutely nothing, right? Just like if you go to the market and you see all these different labels on groceries and they're like, oh, it has this seal on it. And you're like, well, that seal means absolutely nothing because I have no idea where it came from and there's no, standards behind that. It's the same concept, right? But if you say, I might be honest, but like USDA approved, yada, 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 it's like, oh, okay, I know it had to meet certain requirements. Okay, I feel more comfortable with it. So that's kind of what we're driving towards of like, people know what that certification actually stands for? And then, okay, well, can we be flexible on who can be the one certifying it?
Can you comment on whether you've seen companies, and maybe this is one of the reasons why people may utilize Elasticsearch and its capabilities with regards to certification of data within an internal data set? Is that a common process that exists, or is that something that is getting more traction these days? You can tell.
Yeah, I mean, like the principles of like certifying your data or, having different tags or whatever you want to call it associated with your data. It's like that's nothing new. It's different companies and different teams will do it in different ways, depending on like what their standards are. Where I think it starts to become more critical, as the amount of data that we work with and that it becomes, that gets generated just grows exponentially. You do need to make sure that you're thinking about, okay, well, what is the data that we actually are certifying? So the people actually know which data they can trust and which maybe they can't. If we think about moving forward of, okay, well, within our data, here's the data, the definitions, the reports, the dashboards that we have certified as meeting these standards. If I now then say like, okay, well, anybody can go into a ChatGPT-like interface within our company and they can search for, hey, I want to know where I can find information on X, Y, or Z. If I then say I am allowing it to open up to all the data within our warehouse, they can easily get pointed to data that I don't want it to, or report that is in development and not ready for production. So having that certification gives that clarity of like, okay, well, if you see this stamp of approval on it, you know that you can probably trust it. So that's the reason why it's like, it's important. It's really more just so that you are providing that visibility, transparency to your end users of this is what you can trust. If you don't see it, you might have some questions about it. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it doesn't meet those. We haven't certified and that it has met those standards as of yet.
So that must give a lot of your internal customers comfort level that once it's certified and blessed, that it is reliable and deemed to be accurate and relevant. So that's got to be a huge comfort level, huge plus.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that we're working towards though is not just having like a certification process, because what I want to avoid is, okay, for example, Norm, you go look and say like, oh, I see this star or this, badge on this report. So that means it's certified. I can trust it. And then I see like, well, you go search for something else and you don't see that. And you're like, I can't trust it at all. But we'll go back to that conversation about context. What we want to do is also bring in a lot of the context about who's using the data, who built it, who owns it, when was it last updated. All that information also helps you inform you as a user of what you can trust and what you can't trust. What I mean by that is, if let's say you're working with someone and they're like, hey, Norm, there's this great dashboard I've been using, gives me this information about our bookings and whatever it is, right? And then you go search for it and you're like, I don't see anything that's been certified. It's like, I guess it doesn't exist. However, if you see like, okay, here's a few different dashboards and you see, oh, this dashboard is created and owned by this person. Oh, I know who that person is. I know I can trust them. This dashboard is actively being, used by these people. Oh, okay. Well, that's one of the people that, brought to my attention. And these are the people that I know are not just going to take data at face value and they'll be a little bit more diligent. This is where they're going to. It was last refreshed in the last day. Here's some of the data quality metrics associated with it. That gives you context around, oh, I think I can trust this data. It may not be certified, but who owns it, the people that are using it, gives me some comfort that this is probably something I can probably rely on and what I should be using if I'm trying to get an answer in this space. So that's when we start to, when I mentioned context and transparency, the more information you can bring forward to your users to say, here's who's using it, who owns it, the definitions around it. You start to then calibrate from your own perspective of, I think I can rely on this for this reason, for this purpose, because of this information. Absent of that information, you wouldn't feel comfortable. So that's where it's like making sure that we can be more transparent and forthcoming about all of this metadata associated with our data products. That's where it becomes a huge important.
As we get close to the end of our time, before I ask the last question, I just wanted to remind our listeners that if the information that Takashi has imparted to you about data and its importance, please like and subscribe to the reporting norms, and please share this video if you found it especially helpful. And so just to kind of wrap things up, Takashi, with Gen AI and sort of the use of AI as top of mind for everybody, how would you tie in an effective, AI strategy and a data strategy for a company so that the output that comes out of, a AI query is the most accurate it can be?
Yeah. And I'll go back to kind of what I mentioned earlier, and I'll kind of stick to the scope of what my teams are responsible for, and kind of like the space that I work in is more of reporting and analytics side. In that context, there's this desire of like, how can we leverage GenAI? And there's a lot of pockets where, we're already leveraging GenAI in terms of, okay, well, curation of our data, adding definitions. There's AI agents that we can deploy that will kind of populate a first pass of like what a definition will be so that people don't have to go through and, input it for each field, right? It's like those are basic things that we can do. So it kind of spans across the board, and we're leveraging a lot of those in those ways. But for our end users, what they care about is, how can I quickly get the answer that I want without having to go dig through different things, right? So we're taking kind of a phased approach in that regard. The nirvana state is, as a business user, I say like, hey, I have a question. I want to be able to go in and through a chat interface be like, hey, tell me what the revenue was in Japan, Korea, and China for the last, 3 quarters, broken out by second, and it'll give me an answer. The hard part with that is, as I mentioned before, it's like it requires context. And when you interact with like ChatGPT and you say like, hey, I have a question, it gives you a few paragraphs and you're like, okay, I think most of that makes sense. And there's about 10% that probably doesn't make sense, but I got the answer that I want. And you have that context around it. When you're working with numbers, you lose that context because all you see is a singular number. Now, there's different ways of going about it where you can see like, okay, well, here's a logical train of thought that the chat agent used to get to that answer. So you can kind of follow along. But in reality, it's like leaves you exposed to a lot of concerns there. We're building towards that. But in the immediate term, I would say, unless you have robust metadata and you're curating all of your data and you feel very comfortable with the quality of the data that you're allowing to be exposed in this way, I would hesitate to jump to that level. Now, before you get there, there's a very much okay, well, I don't even know what exists. How can you make my experience a lot easier in terms of finding what potentially might be available that might be able to answer my question? And I liken it to, this concept of online shopping versus going shopping in a brick and mortar store. Historically, we're kind of used to going like, hey, I'm going to go to a store and I'm going to go look for what I think I need, right? It's like, I need this. I'm going to go look and go find it. Think of it as like a glossary of terms from a data perspective. A glossary of metrics. The other experience is I know exactly what I want. I want to go to Amazon.com and just type in, hey, I want this, and I'll get a return of things, right? So I don't have to go sift through things at, some store. That experience is like what we definitely need to start building towards, and how do we do that very effectively? And there's a few things that, I would say that we are keeping in mind of. I don't want to bring in another platform where someone has to go somewhere else to another window once a month, and then the next month they forget where it is and they just don't use it. So you need to embed it in the normal day-to-day of how we operate. So how do we best do that? And then again, and this is also some building towards the future of, I still need to do that curation. I still need to make sure that we have the right quality. But the experience isn't, when I ask that question of what's my revenue for these 3 countries over the last 3 quarters, I just get the answer, which is what people want. I at least get, hey, here's where you can find the answer. And that's a kind of that first step and first phase to getting to that nirvana state of like, okay, well, I can just interact with the chat agent and get the answers I want about my data. We're not there yet. And I would say most companies are not going to be there yet, but there's a lot of pressure to get there. But there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done before we can enable something like that.
I think you've covered a lot of, topic, a lot of area here, data management, and this is a pretty big area. I think we may need to have a part 2, Takashi, but I really appreciate you imparting your knowledge and your views on how you have led and basically been the head of data analytics within Elastic and how you manage, data and work with your internal customers, as well as you do. So I want to thank you for your insight and time. And that's basically it for now. And I would say until next time, please stay transparent.